My birthday, 81 years old today. It's a beautiful day. The judge has apologized for the wrongful thing happened to me. And I'm so happy. Waited 38 years for this.
Lawyer James Lockyer lost his bid to have...
August 9th, 1967, Leopold Roy, an apartment building superintendent, was stabbed to death in Ottawa, Canada. This coming from the Canadian Encyclopedia. Leopold Roy's wife, Mildred, spoke with the police, and with her help, they created a composite sketch of the suspect. Romeo Phillion was identified when Mildred Roy and Romeo's friend Gail Brazeau told police that he resembled the composite sketch. According to Innocence Canada, Romeo and his twin brother Donald were both placed in a lineup. Donald was released after they learned he was out of town at the time in question. Romeo Phillion had an alibi and said he was in New Liskeard, Ontario, now called Temiskaming Shores, during the time of the crime. And the police found Gail Brazeau to be incompetent. And they determined the lineup evidence from Mildred Roy was insufficient, so Romeo Phillion was let go. Between 1967 and 1972, Mildred Roy had identified 3 other men as possible suspects, according to the Innocence Canada. The Canadian Encyclopedia stated Romeo Phillion was questioned regarding an armed robbery, and his boyfriend at the time, Neil Miller, was also questioned. Romeo told the police that he was guilty of the Leopold murder back on August 9th, 1967. He told them that he would give a full confession if they allowed him to see Neil Miller, which they did, and Innocence Canada stated that he signed a confession but recanted it later on. Neil Miller claimed Romeo had made a similar confession 4 days before his arrest. October 16, 1972. This is when the trial began. The prosecution used his confession and Mildred Roy's testimony in court. They also claimed that Neil Miller confessed that Romeo Phillion privately confessed to him about murdering Leopold Roy. They apparently painted Romeo Phillion as someone who would confess to just about anything to make himself appear important. The claim was that Phillion and Miller had hatched the idea of confessing in order to receive the reward money, and according to Innocence Canada, there were 2 experts who said Romeo had an antisocial personality and was prone to lie. Their claim was that this disorder prompted him to falsely confess to Leopold's murder. His attorney claimed the police failed to properly investigate and that they had evidence that wasn't presented, such as a hair sample, fingernail scrapings, blood, and samples of Leopold's hair. Despite all of this and his recantation, it didn't look good for Romeo Phillion. November 7th, 1972. The jury found Romeo Phillion guilty of murdering Leopold Roy, and he was sentenced to life in prison with no parole eligibility for 10 years. He attempted to appeal a few times, but all of them failed. Romeo Phillion wasn't exactly a perfect inmate, but he was innocent of this crime, and he refused to even apply for parole after eligibility. This because he refused to admit any sort of guilt in the involvement of Leopold Roy's murder. He also knew that the odds of him being granted parole without admitting guilt would be very slim. So what actually did happen? Trenton, Ontario, 1967. During the time that Leopold Roy was murdered, Romeo Phillion was 237 kilometers away from Ottawa, or about 147 miles, where he stopped to get gas at a station near Trenton, Ontario. And he did initially say he was on his way back to Ottawa from New Liskeard around that same time. Police visited the gas station near Trenton, Ontario. The owner did confirm that Romeo Phillion had been there between noon and 1 p.m. the day of the murder. The owner of the gas station was quoted in the police report saying that Romeo had traded him a car radio as payment for some gas, and that it would have been impossible for him to have committed the crime in Ottawa, and it would have been impossible for him to have reached Ottawa in time to commit the murder, although this report was never provided to his lawyer. Now we're in 1998. One day, a parole officer at Kingston Penitentiary left that very police report, often referred to as the McComey report, in Romeo Phillion's cell. Romeo sent this report to the Innocence Project at Osgoode Hall Law School. He had continued to profess his innocence all those years. until the Innocence Project and the Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted, now known as Innocence Canada, took his case in the early aughts. They submitted a 696.1 or a 696.1 application to the Federal Minister of Justice for a review of Romeo Phillion's case, and they used a criminal code provision that permits cases to be reopened when there is pertinent fresh evidence. The Innocence Project and the now known Innocence Canada also found new evidence in Romeo's favor. There were multiple errors and inconsistencies in his original statement, such as outright incorrect information where he guessed at details of the crime. According to the Canadian Registry of Wrongful Convictions, Romeo Phillion said he'd broken into Leopold Roy's apartment, stole a knife, and stabbed him on the back stairs before fleeing. But no one had broken into an apartment in that building, and no knives were stolen. He also took police to a bridge that he claimed was the location where he threw bloodied clothes into the river. But again, he then changed his mind regarding the location when he realized the bridge wasn't even accessible by car, and so he took them to a different bridge. Now we're in 2006. Romeo Phillion was granted bail when he waited for the Minister of Justice to look at his application. He then ordered a special hearing to be held by the Ontario Court of Appeal to reconsider Romeo Phillion's case. Detective McComie testified that he found other evidence that discredited Romeo's alibi, but the court concluded he didn't receive a fair trial. The court decided the Crown did not intentionally pursue the case against Romeo Phillion, knowing he was innocent. The Crown had a copy of the McComie report, but it was never disclosed to Romeo's attorney, and a retrial was reordered. April 29th, 2010. The Crown withdrew the charge against Romeo Phillion, and no one was willing to try the case again after so much time had passed. Although this was good news, this also meant that he was not yet considered a victim of a miscarriage of justice and would not receive any compensation. He also turned 71 years old that same day. In 2013, Romeo filed a lawsuit against the police and the Crown, but it was dismissed by an Ontario Superior Court judge. In 2015, the Supreme Court of Canada disagreed with the dismissal and upheld Romeo's right to pursue the lawsuit. Unfortunately, Romeo Phillion passed away on November 2nd, 2015 at the age of 76, and he had spent 31 years in prison for a crime he did not do.